Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm your host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is a weekly news program brought to you from the Valley Access Studios in Stillwater, Minnesota. Now, to help me this day with our news for the week is Mr. Mark Bradley, a regular Citizen Reporter. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I'd like to talk about what's happening in the state Senate right now, which I kind of find ironic and actually oppressive for most taxpayers, because the Senate GOP is unveiling an affordable insulin plan.
And certainly, while we are not against folks having affordable access to insulin, because obviously that's very necessary, and I think there's like about 400,000 individuals in the state of Minnesota that are diabetic who need the insulin. There's other concerns that you have about the proposal, correct?
Correct. And what I'm really looking at is the fact that if they really cared, I think that they should be actually taking first the inquiry on why the price of insulin is going up at this point, since it is a product that the price should be going down on. It doesn't seem like there is less people that have the need for this, for diabetic type of insulins.
Yeah, and Mr. Bradley, your point is well taken in that insulin is not some cutting edge medication.
Right.
Certainly, we understand that when there's new medications put on the market, that their costs might be higher because there's the R&D research costs that have gone into the production of that new drug or prescription. But insulin has been around for a very long time. It's not an unusual medication for somebody who's who has diabetes to be on. It is very commonplace. Understanding that the prices now have soared to such a high that a 10-day supply can run $300. And I don't see any reason or rationale behind those kinds of costs in the marketplace.
Our politicians are taking the public to task rather than taking the corporations to task. The thing is, the corporations are getting larger and larger at this point, and we're not paying attention to that fact at all. What we're really paying attention to is the fact that somebody at the bottom end needs it. So what are we doing? We're saying, okay, this is something that that they absolutely need, so we're going to cover it completely, but we're going to then say that the public's going to have to pick up the extra costs, and we're not going to even ask why those costs have gone up by the corporations are making it.
That is an important point to bring out, is that the pharmaceutical companies that are producing the insulin, what are the restraints or legislation going into place to put caps on the amount that can be charged for something like insulin that is very commonplace, that is a prescription that is needed by a large segment of the population. And you bring up a good point in that while it's certainly good for those folks who can't afford insulin to be able to give it to them for free, if you're not addressing those elevated costs, ultimately other consumers who are paying into the system are making up the difference in the gap, and then it's just basically justifying that those elevated costs can continue.
Right. In fact, they'll increase at that point because the fact is there's less people to pay for it. And the fact is, what I'm trying to also point out is the fact that a lot of these pharmaceutical companies basically have been merging together. In fact, another article I have, which happens to be talking about a merger that is of such massive extent, is called AB InBev, which is actually the parent corporation for Anheuser-Busch. That's the AB part of it. And that's an Asian business. We've been talking about how these corporations are becoming monoliths in their own situations.
In their own fields or industries, yes.
In fact, it was originally proposed that AB InBev was supposed to go for a $12 billion, not million, billion with a B, dollar initial public offering because as they created, they said, we're going to spin this part. This is only a segment of the whole corporation that it's under. We're looking at $4.8 billion as initial public offering for the stock as it comes out. I thought I'd bring up something that's actually related to Maplewood and is coming up. And I think it's September 26th. They're supposed to have at the Maplewood YMCA, it's supposed to be, as they call it, a entrepreneurial approach to public safety, or safe. They didn't put safety in there. They didn't put the TY in there. Public safe.
Oh, really? So they
Yeah.
misspelled it on their website?
Well, yes, they misspelled it on their website. That's why I did a copy so you could take a look at it.
Well, let's take a look. Here you go. Mr. Bradley has made a copy of the screenshot of the website, and there you can see it. It says entrepreneurial approach to public
Safe.
safe.
And my point here is, I'm not sure if they're talking about the police themselves, but I think it is, or if they're talking about that where they're supposed to have that call-in 911 system.
Well, here is what their description is. The Maplewood Public Safety Department is bringing an entrepreneurial approach to delivering efficient, cost-effective solutions to their community's biggest needs, especially in the areas of mental health, emergency medicine, senior and community outreach, and education. So when they say an entrepreneurial approach to these issues, I'm not exactly sure what they mean, but perhaps we should have a person in attendance at this meeting so that we can report on this on our next program.
I have. Now, I have another article that I've been looking at. Also, I'm going to aim at Maplewood directly, right between the eyes. And that's because of the article doesn't talk about Maplewood, but it talks about hotel companies and flagships are key. And the thing is, it sounds like, well, what does that have to do with Maplewood? Well, the flagships in these hotel companies, like the W Hotel and the Radisson, when that was supposed to be the #1 hotel, and Hilton, which always is a good hotel name to look for, are the ones that you look for when you are trying to stay at a place that you're finding dependable, and you're not going to have to worry about maybe that you're going to have somebody moaning and groaning in the next room is paying hourly rates, or that you're going to have to worry about there's supposed to be something crawling in your bed. So those things are things that you have to look for, and that's why you go to a flagship. And they say that the hotels are looking at that they're adding extra amenities that you wouldn't even imagine at their flagships, because of that says that this is a place to stay. Same thing goes with any city. And the problem with Maplewood, we don't even have anything that even is close to being a flagship hotel, let alone a lesser hotel.
Right. And certainly we have discussed this on previous news programs and pointed out that certainly up by the Maplewood Mall area at one time there were 2 hotels. Now there's just 1.
Right.
And while Maplewood, as part of these grandiose plans for the North End study, which we're going to be talking more about in the later half of this program, while they indicate that they want to put a hotel, another hotel in and have another hotel located in and around the Maplewood Mall, they've essentially eliminated in that grandiose plan all reason to make the Maplewood Mall area a destination location.
Right.
And so for many hotels that are indeed the big names, the flagships, they are putting their hotels where there is a destination location, because that's how they can attract the people who have the dollars to spend at their for their accommodations at those hotels. And Maplewood, in their grandiose plan for the North End study, have basically, as we're going to show, have taken out any reason why anybody would actually go to the Maplewood Mall unless you thought you're going to live in one of the high-rise apartments that they are planning that they would like to see in place of the Maplewood Mall.
Right.
I mean, why would you put a hotel next to a bunch of housing? It just doesn't make sense. And this particular article that Mr. Bradley is drawing our attention to is in the business section of the Star Tribune, dated September 2nd. And it does say that in a competitive industry that the top spots help hotelers stand out from the crowd. And Mr. Bradley indicated the various different amenities that they're adding that will have them stand out over and above the other places that people might have as choices to stay. And I think partly, and I don't know if this article talks about this at all, but I think that there is a pressure on the hotel industry to try and stand out from what they were in the past, because there are more options for people today, considering that there are many people who are participating in Airbnb. And I don't know, Mr. Bradley, if you've ever stayed at an Airbnb or not, but I know I have stayed at any number of Airbnbs, and while it isn't the same kind of experience as a hotel experience, it is certainly a form of lodging that does directly compete with the hotel industry. So thank you for bringing this article to our attention.
And then I do have one other article I wanted to point out, because of last week we were talking about how all the construction that's happening in Ramsey County, Maplewood, is this subsidized housing. And of course, like we talked about with Premier stuff here, we have the situation where flippers are fight for low stock of houses. And it says the market's great for market rate housing. So why are we taking two properties, and the other one is Hillcrest, which is just adjoining Maplewood, which is another property that's being looked at low-income housing in this area, other than it's being turned into a GHETTO, and I believe it.
What's next on the agenda, Mr. Bradley?
Well, I think we're almost about halfway through, so I figured I wasn't going to throw any more of this out there, even though I did have an article that did express that even on these light rail systems and the bus systems, that there is a fallacy that's been created. We should be looking at from the standpoint, what is the best logical routes for our mass transit, and quit this gobbledygook that we're always being thrown at, that, geez, east side of St. Paul, we can't do it there because they don't have that elevated height. But in Minneapolis, they have that
of their buildings.
Of their buildings. But Minneapolis has it everywhere. No, it doesn't have it everywhere. And where they're talking about their mass transit, a lot of that doesn't have it there.
Well, and I think it's not always just the factor of what the density is.
Right.
It also has to do, what does the line connect?
Correct.
Because if the population in and around the stations isn't necessarily going to any of the destinations of that line is not going to be successful. You can't just simply say, well, if we build it, they will come. For instance, in the Gladstone neighborhood and the Rush line, the purple line that's going through the Bruce Vento Trail. Well, in Maplewood, almost the majority of that Bruce Vento Trail is in the backyards of single-family residential households. And so to use that phrase, build it and they will come, is not accurate, because no developer is going to go in and do an assemblage of purchasing all these single-family homes and then going to the city to change all the zoning and the comprehensive plan to allow commercial development along the Bruce Vento Trail. That's just not practical. It is certainly a fallacy. And just to let our viewers know, we had reported on a previous program that the Policy Advisory Committee of the Rush Line is going on a field trip to Richmond, Virginia, October 2nd through the 5th, where they're going to be looking at the BRT, the Bus Rapid Transit route that's in Richmond, Virginia. Now that particular route, if I remember correctly, is only about 4 miles long or so. But they are going on this field trip to see this BRT route in action because it is one that they think is very much akin and is similar to what they plan on building up and down the Bruce Vento Trail, except that we have done a program to show how the demographics and the population and the positioning of the BRT in Richmond, Virginia is indeed very different and dissimilar from that is being proposed for the Bruce Vento Trail. Now, some of our reporters from Put Your Hands Together Productions is going out to Richmond, Virginia during the period of October 2nd to October 5th. And so when we return, we will have a report to give to our viewers with regard to our findings about the BRT in Richmond, Virginia. And then hopefully we will have film footage of the Policy Advisory Committee members here on the Rush Line Committee and their take on their field trip. We'll be hopefully attending their meeting so we can hear what they have to say, and then we'll have our viewers come to their own conclusions whether or not that this field trip was really of any value or not. Now keep in mind, I believe that a similar field trip had been arranged a couple years ago to go out to California.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how many more field trips do they need to go on to understand how a souped up bus line operates.
But the major point I'm looking at is the fact that when you're looking at them, they are still trying to look at it from the standpoint that you had made initially, that we're looking at destinations. And when we're looking at the destination for our BRT that's here, at one end is downtown St. Paul, which is a bustling city with many, many retail outlets for people to want to go to. And take a look at all the theaters that are there. There are, I think you got, well, we won't talk about the theaters.
Oh, Mr. Bradley, you're joking about trying to point out how much of a destination location it is not.
Right, and then we could take a look at the other end, which is Maplewood Mall. They're not going any farther than Maplewood Mall, so Maplewood Mall's the other end of the destination. And what are they talking about? Well, Maplewood Mall's in such devastated shape, we're going to tear half of it down, and we'll be talking about that the second half here. But hey, God dang it, putting that bus line is going to guarantee it for us now.
Tuning into the second half of our program, we're going to be switching gears now, and we're going to focus on the North End Study Work Group report that was provided to the Planning Commission of Maplewood. Now, before we do, though, we're going to introduce to you a couple of clips that we found on the internet that are addressing some of the issues at other malls, because certainly there are malls in the United States that are having problems with vacancies, having problems with remaining viable. If you've been up to the Maplewood Mall lately, you know that the Sears has closed, that there have been a number of smaller shops that have closed. Some people say the closures will not stop, and eventually that the Maplewood Mall might become a mall such as in Euclid, Ohio. Now, on the internet, there's been several news reports about the malls in Ohio, and our first clip is from an individual who has a blog. He is an internet journalist, goes by Rockstar, but let's take a look at a portion of his description of a mall that he has been studying and reporting on.
The average Amazon distribution warehouse is 650,000 square feet. Look at that. It lines right up with the size of these malls. It's perfect. So they know how big of a building they can put on this property. Plus the parking. Perfect. Okay.
In his reports, what he has been reporting on is the fact that Amazon is looking at many of these malls as a great location to set up a distribution center. And a distribution center for Amazon produces anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 jobs. Think about that here on the east side of St. Paul and in Maplewood, that if we had a distribution center that produced 5,000 to 10,000 jobs, wouldn't that be something? And what his point is that when you look at the footprint of a mall and the amount of parking that is there as part of that mall, it is an ideal footprint for someone like Amazon to set up a distribution center. Or if it isn't Amazon, it could be any number of other companies. It doesn't have to be a company as large as Amazon. You could actually have an area like the Maplewood Mall be a consortium of any number of different distribution centers for different companies, depending upon who is interested. Now, the Wall Street Journal has also reported on this, and this next clip is from them, and it talks again about that footprint and the amount of square footage that's needed for distribution centers and how it's a great matchup when you compare that with the mall's footprint.
Amazon's fulfillment centers are enormous. Their footprints can reach to hundreds of thousands or even millions of square feet. The suburban shopping malls built in the late 20th century similarly were quite large. For example, the Euclid Square Mall occupied about 650,000 square feet of land. The Amazon Fulfillment Center in Euclid is larger, spanning roughly 855,000 square feet.
See the amount of square footage and the area needed works out very well. Now, Mr. Bradley, you were on the working group for the North End study, and in the meetings that you went to, did they ever talk about the possibility of changing the mall area from a retail shopping mall area to something more like a distribution center or a way to encourage and increase jobs in Maplewood?
Well, they did look at reclassifying the names, but they didn't explain why. And the fact is that when they were looking at it was to, as they said, was to create more housing.
So when they talked about changing the zoning from commercial, which it currently is, they were not looking to change it to something that would encourage a distribution center, for instance.
No, not that I could understand at that point, but you see, as far as I was concerned, they never did want to really have any answers. They were looking at just getting okayed from the group that they hired.
So the focus generally was on housing.
Right.
Wow. So there you go. So for the Maplewood study, instead of thinking about how to turn commercial property, which is highly valuable if you want to encourage any kind of business in your community and jobs in your community, instead they wanted to switch it to housing.
Right.
Okay. Well, now also as part of this discussion, the internet journalist that I spoke of, Rockstar, he also talked about the importance of the access to transportation corridors for companies such as Amazon when they're deciding to establish a distribution center. Of course, that just makes sense since they've got trucks coming in
Right.
and out, and that's what their business is getting goods in and out of their distribution center and then out to the consumers who have purchased the products. So let's take a look at his next clip and think about what he has to say. And rather than thinking about the mall in Ohio that he's using as his example, think of Maplewood Mall and its position at the intersection of 694 and White Bear Avenue.
The malls are accessible via major highways, which are only around the corner. So if we go ahead and zoom out of this Cuyahoga County mall, we're in the back of it now. If we go ahead and zoom out, and I can't really recall how to do it like that. Look, we can see if we keep zooming up on this satellite view, look at the roads coming into the mall, look at the major highways that crisscross this entire area.
So at one point there, you could see the transportation corridors, and you could almost visualize that might be a bird's eye view of the Maplewood Mall and the transportation corridors around the Maplewood Mall. And of course, don't forget there's also Highway 61, which is right directly west of the mall and has an exit in and off of 694 as well as White Bear Avenue does. And the report from the Wall Street Journal also focused on the importance of transportation corridors when you're looking at setting up a distribution center and why malls are a good fit. Let's take a look.
Because land uses are typically separated here, malls weren't typically built inside the boundaries of residential neighborhoods. They were instead built near highway interchanges, which brings us to another major reason why malls can make great fulfillment centers: proximity to the highway.
The Euclid Square Mall site is located pretty much right in the center of the city of Euclid. It was built in the late 70s. I think that was a trend, trying to locate malls close to freeways, basically.
Now, on this program, Mr. Bradley, this is not new news to us, because we have actually reported on these aspects of why the Maplewood Mall is at a great location for commercial development,
Right.
because of the amount of space there is, the parking availability, and the access to the transportation corridors. And so this is not rocket science. We know it, we've reported on it for several years now, and yet the working group that was charged with putting together a visionary plan for the Maplewood Mall area basically missed a lot of these points. Instead, they, as you have already indicated previously, basically it was set to justify the vision of City Hall and their vision that they want housing there,
Right.
not what is actually the best and highest use for this property. Now we are going to now move to some of the video film footage from the Maplewood Planning Commission meeting, where the consultant who was charged with spearheading this project is giving a report. So let's tune in.
Here's the graphic representation of the near-term sort of recommendations that we identified. A real big key focal point of this, I think, is this idea that there's a new thoroughfare that would connect the St. John's Hospital on the west end of the north end, and then with the mall on the east end of the north end. And that was really seen as something that, if we could imagine that being kind of a new spine upon which development over time can kind of grow off of, and it just serves to sort of connect and help establish new synergies among, hospital workers that might want to get to the mall and so forth and back and forth.
It's ironic that he thinks that any of the hospital workers want to actually go several blocks away to the mall when these very same plans have a depiction of a great portion of the mall being demolished. and that there's very little retail at all. Now, if we can bring that map up real quick, I want to identify those colors of those little boxes that we saw. And as we do that, I'll talk to you, I'll identify those colors. Now, the yellow boxes that are on this map are housing. And you'll see that there's green patches between all of the yellow structures. Well, that is green space. And then the orange is what's called mixed use, which is residential and commercial. And then you'll see that little red structure area, that's retail. And the aqua blue color is where they envision that there's going to be, that they would like to see a hotel. Now, generally speaking, hotels would like to be situated closer to the intersection, which in this picture you can see is in the upper right-hand corner. That's where the intersection is. So a hotel to be located many, many blocks away from the 694 freeway and the intersection, I don't think is necessarily going to draw a big name hotel to a location that isn't the optimal location for a hotel. Now let's move on to our next clip as he continues with the big vision.
To really start to introduce these ideas of making the area more walkable, more green, more multimodal, so other modes of transportation other than the car, people can get around and through this area, as well as the future of BRT investment.
We are looking to eliminate cars. I mean, that in a nutshell is what he is saying they want to do. They want to put in all this housing which will support the investment of the BRT, the souped up bus line that they're going to be putting in on the Bruce Vento Trail. And so they're expecting that all these people living in all this new housing will be using the BRT to go somewhere. Well, the primary employer in St. Paul is the government. Whether or not that is the state of Minnesota, Ramsey County, or the city of St. Paul. If you were to take a look at those as a group, the government, they are the single largest employer in St. Paul. So is the BRT just simply being structured to give transportation to folks who are working for the government to make it easy and accessible for them to get to work? Because where's the other employment in St. Paul?
Well, you can't forget that there's another group that would be using that, and that's the people that happen to be right in that area that was just redeveloped called Gladstone. And those are subsidized housing. But if you eliminate 3M off the list, who is the number one industry in Maplewood that supplies most of the jobs and the tax base for Maplewood at this present time? And it's the auto industry. And yet we have a city council that says, we don't know, we don't care, and we don't really think it's responsible. Yet most of the people that are living here right now haven't.
And certainly, when you're saying the auto industry, you're referring to the car dealerships.
Car dealerships,
right.
But also the ones that are doing the maintenance, like your shops that are doing the repainting, the ones that are doing the labor on doing tune-ups and stuff. Because you got your Tires Plus and Firestone and those type of units out there too.
That's right.
So the fact is that when you start taking a look at the biggest industry is car industry.
Well, Mr. Bradley, you've brought up an irony that certainly can't be lost on our viewers, that in Maplewood there are a lot of jobs in and connected to the use of automobiles in our community, whether or not it's the dealerships or the supporting industries, like you mentioned, tires, repair. There's the auto body shops, many of them in Maplewood. And it is ironic that since that is a large employment sector in Maplewood, that the Maplewood Council and administrators up at City Hall are doing everything they can to eliminate the use of autos up by the Maplewood Mall, which should be a commercial area. Now let's move on to our next clip as we continue the discussion.
And here you can see the kind of our recommendations for what could be a eventual build out based on all of those principles and goals that we identified throughout this process. So we have some, we created some, nice imagery to really help people maybe visualize how some of these ideas could start to look at different perspectives.
Did they draw those, or those look like they're what they call stock pictures that they pulled out of a file?
Yes, exactly, Mr. Bradley. And, we have shown these particular stock photos and illustrations previously just to, again, highlight how out of touch this is. And that site plan that he showed there, again, you could see the extent of the housing by the yellow squares. You saw how much green space there is, and while that's nice to have green space if you're going to have housing, you have to think about the property tax consequences when you are moving property from its best and highest use as commercial to something different like green space. Well, I'll tell you, I'm not quite sure who's going to own this green space, but green space is not going to be as highly taxed or income producing for the property tax revenue department as commercial property or industrial property.
Somebody has to maintain it.
Well, that's right. Somebody does have to maintain it. So let's take a look at our next clip as he continues with his presentation.
So, and I think that yeah, and we there's different, based on the types of recommendations, we also identified a number of potential funding sources that could be a resource, whether it's grants, that could, whether there's a taxing structure that can help capture value as new investment happens, and then that can kind of feed back in and be kind of a revolving pool of money. And there's, working with the development community as they think about sort of a potential investment as well. So yeah, we've got some ideas there. It's not just simply, here you go, here's a bunch of ideas. Good luck trying to figure out how to make them work. We have some ideas and some resources for how to generate revenue.
These are all the same stock ideas for funding that you always hear. All you have to do is open up a textbook, and one of those funding tools is tax increment financing.
Right.
Of course, that's not unique. That's not of any particular interest other than to say that the city of Maplewood is looking to give tax increment financing to encourage somebody to build housing on what should be commercial property. Well, he also talked about the city investment. Well, city investment, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're going to go and take money out of the sanitary utility fund once more? Money that's destined for use in our road reconstruction projects, and instead divert that money over to buying properties up by the Maplewood Mall, just like they did in the Gladstone area, to the tune of, $2 million at least? Well, there's a whole lot of questions here, and so his pretended statement that they have financing options identified, well, they really haven't done anything other than just give lip service to the same old tired ideas. None of it that they've talked about actually includes going out and trying to recruit organizations such as Amazon or other distributors who might say, boy, I would like to be located at the intersection of 694, 61, and White Bear Avenue. Wow, what a great location to be able to have the operation, and imagine all the workers that would have access to that location, because for your employees, you would be drawing not only from Maplewood, but you would be drawing from White Bear Lake. You'd be drawing from Oakdale. You'd be drawing from other communities in and around that circle within a 5-mile radius. And it would be indeed good for the region around Maplewood to have that kind of job potential.
Right.
But that is not what was ever discussed in this North End study work group.
No.
In that last site plan we looked at, you notice that there was very little red around the outside of the Maplewood Mall. So they didn't actually even highlight the entire Maplewood Mall as retail, which is an indication that they think that the Maplewood Mall is going to be something different other than retail. So what could that be? Well, let's take a look at our next clip.
Plan is trying to recognize is that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of where different types of uses can occur in the whole North End, frankly, and so in other places where we did case studies of malls that have sort of been transitioning, some of them have actually taken some of their former department stores and their educational facilities. So if there's a point at which the density increases enough that really does drive the need for a new school, there may be opportunities to adaptively reuse some of the existing retail space that's no longer viable. But there's also the ability to recognize that a lot of these uses can and should work well together. So it's not simply about we're just going to build so many new residential units that we don't have any room to accommodate anything else. And we have now a density, or we have a neighborhood that doesn't have critical needs being met. We would like to think that there's that space and the flexibility to be able to accommodate.
In other words, between the lines, he's saying that they want to convert the majority of the Maplewood Mall space to a school. Now, Mr. Bradley, we'd be taking commercial property that pays commercial property taxes and convert it to a school, and generally speaking, most schools are non-tax paying entities. They don't pay property taxes.
Right.
So now Maplewood's grand vision is to turn good commercial property into property that pays no property taxes at all. Now, is that a good vision and a best and highest use for land that is located at an intersection of a good transportation corridor? Exactly the kind of area that companies are looking for, companies that have good paying, sustainable jobs. Now, here's something I want to share with you with our next clip, is that many malls and many retail areas are finding that there is a best and higher use than their retail use. And it's a growing national trend, and it's a trend that Maplewood didn't even bother to identify in putting together this study for the North End Study Group and looking at what is the future of the Maplewood Mall area. Let's take a look at this clip, which is from CBRE, which is a big name in commercial real estate management and marketing and trends. Let's take a look.
2 malls in Northeast Ohio ties in with a bigger trend. Analysis from CBRE Group reveals 23 similar transfers from brick-and-mortar retail space to new industrial uses across the country.
We've had an extraordinary demand cycle since the recession ended in 2010. Industrial real estate tends to do very well in economic expansionary periods, and the way an e-commerce supply chain is built, it requires significantly more real estate. It tends to require more locations, which has absorbed almost all of the available supply in the market. There's demand for industrial warehouse space in places that warehouse spaces just do not exist.
The statistics show that retail space is being converted into industrial warehousing distribution space. And this is the type of use that is producing the jobs today and is anticipated to continue to produce jobs in the future. And this is a great location there where the Maplewood Mall is located, where they still could have retail, but they could also use some of that retail space for distribution and warehousing because of the location to transportation corridors. Now let's take a look at the next statistic.
CBRE analysis shows 7.9 million square feet of retail converting into 10.9 million square feet of industrial space.
Now those are in tremendous numbers. And yet, Mr. Bradley, did they ever talk about this trend in the North End Working Group meetings?
No, they haven't.
In our next clip, let's hear then what the consultant is going to conclude with.
What is the future of malls?
What's the future of the mall?
Not this particular, just mall in general. I mean, mall came out all of a sudden. Everybody was having mall and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, for example, we've heard from so the main owner of the mall is a group called Washington Prime Group, and they are a real estate investment trust that I believe was spun off of. Was that Simon? That was Simon. Okay, Simon Properties, which is there's 2 giant companies that own lots of malls across the country. Simon Properties is one of them. The other one, I think, is Growth Management Properties. So this group that owns part of the Maplewood Mall is a particular entity that has an affiliation with Simon Properties. We have heard from in presentations and talks from other Simon Properties people that they talk about when they're now to the point that when department stores actually announce closures in their mall properties, they're actually excited about that because they see the department store concept as being so outmoded at this point and a lot of these malls were the economics around them were built around the fact that the department store was what drove people there and generated everything, and now sadly the era of the department store is on its way out, if it isn't almost all the way out. And so the mall owners like Simon Properties look at that now as they can move on and we can get much more creative and innovative about what to do with that space.
He acknowledges that the owners that own the primary portion of the mall, that they have indicated that when it comes up in some other mall that there's a retailer who's leaving, that they're actually happy about it because then they can do something else with their property. Well, except that he does not acknowledge that more than likely that real estate investment firm, that they know and they appreciate that the growing trend is to change that retail space into industrial space where they can get higher dollars for their square footage than they can for retail. And they're not excited that they're going to convert their retail to housing, where they get less per square foot than they would get if they converted it to industrial. They're excited because they can actually then convert it, as the trends have shown, to industrial, where they can get a higher amount of per square foot. That's the point. And he didn't discuss that at all
Right.
with the Planning Commission. They didn't discuss that at all with your working group.
Right. In fact, the other thing I'd have to point out is that whenever there was any type of pointing to the fact of what's happening with big box reusing, and that's the same issue at the same time, because of a lot of the smaller big boxes are being abandoned, like when you look at what's happening with Walmart. They're building bigger Walmarts, so they have to leave the smaller Walmarts, and other stores out there. You take a look at what's happening with them. And when we were looking at such things as what happened with Rainbow in the area, and out in other areas, there's Dave and Buster's has gone into, of all places, Southdale, which is a shopping center that's still there and growing and bustling.
Right, and so what your point is that there's many different things that are happening in the trends involving malls that were not included for discussion by the North End Working
Right.
Group. And even with all of this, you would think that certainly an organization such as the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce, who is supposed to be interested in the generation of business and of employment and jobs and the economy, you would think that they would look at the North End Study Work Group product and scratch their head and think, what's missing here? Instead, we find out that they might potentially award to Maplewood for their out-of-touch study. Let's take a look.
Area Chamber of Commerce is having their local government awards luncheon, and Maplewood has been fortunate enough to be nominated for 2 awards, one relating to our public safety department and their initiatives in community outreach, and also our planning community development department, and everyone really, for the North End study, our planning process. And so we can't wait to see how we do. Ironically, I got a call today from the St. Paul Chamber. It was one of those courtesy calls from board members saying, how are things going? And I said, well, we're really happy to be nominated for those 2 local government awards. We had a nice little chat. So it was nice that they checked in once in a while. So that was a good conversation. We did talk about our business retention program and some of the things that we're working on with the chamber. And they are really good partners.
So that is Melinda Coleman, who is the city manager of Maplewood. And Maplewood has hired the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce to assist the city of Maplewood in their business retention program to encourage businesses to remain in Maplewood. And yet Maplewood, through their North End Study report and recommendations, is actually moving commercial businesses and business opportunity out of the Maplewood Mall area, which is contrary to the very thing that of business retention that the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce is hired to assist Maplewood with. So with that in mind, why is Maplewood up for an award from the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce when on the one hand they say they're trying to retain business, and on the other hand they're doing everything they can to move business out of the Maplewood Mall area?
Diane.
You see what I'm saying?
Diane, I've got to stop you for a second here. You got to take a look at you've got 2 cities, and that's the only 2 cities that are going to be up for this award anyway. It's going to be St. Paul or Maplewood. And you got to say to yourself, is St. Paul doing such a great job itself? When you compare St. Paul to Maplewood, Maplewood's actually doing better. But they're trying to get down to where St. Paul is. That's the reality here. We it's like the kettle calling the pot black. They're both totally in a bad situation, and neither one can find the way out. If Maplewood wanted to have a city, they'd been better off going to White Bear or to Stillwater or to maybe Minneapolis even to ask them for help. But we could look at a lot of business areas that have vital areas, and people are still shopping at home. Everybody's buying off the internet now, you hear. But let's realize a lot of stuff you can't buy off the internet because you have to look at
Well,
it.
I want to thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here to help with this week's news program. And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Complete with 12,750 parking spaces, 30,000 live plants, 11,000 employees, and more than 500 stores, the Mall of America boasts around 40 million annual visitors. The Mall of America is surviving the so-called retail apocalypse. But that's because it's less of a shopping destination than a retail-themed tourist attraction. But for malls that lack an indoor amusement park and an aquarium, the future looks much bleaker. There are 1,200 malls left in the U.S., and about a quarter at risk of closing in the next decade. Whether a mall hangs on or not depends largely on the survival of its anchor stores, the giant department stores that were once a mainstay of the American shopping experience. Sears, Macy's, and JCPenney each closed around 100 anchor stores this year, and with them, more than 9,000 other retailers are targeted to close. And retail employees are feeling those closures. The retail sector, which employs about 10% of people in the U.S., saw 4 straight months of steep job losses this year, before slightly ticking upward in the last 2 months. Still, more than 44,000 retail jobs have been lost this year alone. So what's behind the impending retail apocalypse? It's easy to point to Amazon and the growth of e-commerce, but that isn't the whole story. Analysts offer a few other reasons. For one, we built way too many malls. Between 1970 and 2015, the number of malls grew twice as fast as the population. And while mid-market retailers have struggled, outlet and discount stores like Marshall's and TJ Maxx have thrived. And finally, in post-recession America, people are spending more on experiences, travel, bars, restaurants, than buying the latest Hot Topic t-shirt at the mall. Despite all this isn't the end of malls. Developers are converting empty anchor spaces into medical centers and office buildings, which could reshape malls as city centers for rural areas.